Martha Whitmore had never touched a rope, never saddled a horse, and had certainly never branded a calf. The closest she'd come to cattle was when she prepared beef roasts in the cramped kitchen of the boarding house where she'd worked for 7 years. Her hands, soft and flour-dusted, knew the weight of rolling pins and mixing bowls, not leather reins and iron tools. Yet here she stood on the front porch of the Double Bar Ranch, watching her new husband Samuel ride toward the horizon, his silhouette growing smaller against the endless Montana sky. The marriage had been arranged through letters, a practical solution to 2 lonely problems. Samuel needed a wife to cook and keep house on his sprawling ranch, 30 miles from the nearest town. Martha needed security and a roof over her head after the boarding house closed. Neither had spoken of love in their careful correspondence, only of needs and expectations. She would cook, clean, and tend the vegetable garden. He would provide shelter, protection, and a modest allowance for necessities. But as Martha watched the dust settle from Samuel's departure, she realized how little she understood about the life she'd agreed to share. The boarding house had been predictable: breakfast at 6, lunch at noon, supper at 5, with the same familiar faces around worn wooden tables. Here, the silence stretched as far as the rolling grasslands, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through prairie grass. The ranch house itself was larger than she'd expected, built from weathered pine logs with a wraparound porch that caught the morning sun. Inside, the rooms felt cavernous after her small boarding house quarters. The kitchen was well appointed with a massive cast iron stove, but the larder held supplies she'd never worked with: salt pork, hardtack, and sacks of beans that could feed an army. Samuel had mentioned he employed 6 ranch hands who expected 3 square meals a day, men with appetites honed by long hours in the saddle and endless physical labor. Her first attempt at cooking for the crew was a disaster that still made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She'd prepared the delicate beef stew and fresh bread that had won praise at the boarding house, but the men stared at the dainty portions with barely concealed bewilderment. Jake Morrison, the grizzled foreman with silver-streaked hair and hands like leather, had been kind enough to speak for the group. "Mrs. Samuel," he'd said quietly, "this here's mighty fine cooking, but we're gonna need something that sticks to our ribs a bit more. We got a long day ahead, and this wind's got teeth in it." The next morning, Martha found herself staring at the enormous sacks of beans and flour, feeling as lost as she had on her first day at the boarding house 7 years ago. But that had been different. Mrs. Henderson had been there to guide her, to show her the rhythms of institutional cooking. Here, she was alone with her pride and a growing understanding that everything she knew about cooking would need to change. Samuel returned 3 days later, dust-covered and weary from moving cattle to winter pasture. He found Martha in the kitchen at dawn, surrounded by open cookbooks and pages of notes she'd scribbled during sleepless nights. She looked up when he entered, flour in her dark hair and determination in her brown eyes. "I need to learn," she said simply. "Not just cooking for ranch hands, but everything. I can't be the woman who only knows how to cook when there's so much more I need to understand." Samuel studied her face in the lamplight, seeing something he hadn't noticed in their brief courtship. Behind the practical arrangement of their marriage, behind the careful letters and modest expectations, was a woman with steel in her spine. He poured himself coffee from the pot she kept perpetually warm and sat across from her at the scarred wooden table. "What do you want to know?" he asked. "Everything," Martha repeated. "I want to understand this land, these animals, what you do when you ride out for days at a time. I want to know why Jake looks worried when he studies the sky, and why you count cattle like other men count money. I married a rancher, but I don't know what that means." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, watching steam rise from his coffee cup. In all his 35 years, through the death of his parents and the struggle to build the Double Bar from nothing, no one had ever asked to understand his world so completely. "It won't be easy," he warned. "Ranch work isn't gentle, and this land doesn't forgive mistakes." Martha met his eyes steadily. "Neither does cooking for 6 hungry men when you don't know what you're doing." The next morning marked the beginning of Martha's true education. Samuel started her with the horses, teaching her to read their moods and movements before she ever touched a saddle. Buttercup, an aging mare with infinite patience, became her unwitting teacher as Martha learned to curry, bridle, and eventually mount. Her muscles ached in ways she'd never imagined, and her hands blistered from reins and tools, but she persisted. Jake Morrison proved to be an unexpected ally. The foreman had initially been skeptical of the arrangement marriage, but Martha's determination won his grudging respect. He taught her to read weather signs in cloud formations and wind patterns, showed her how to identify sick cattle by their stance and breathing, and patiently explained the endless cycle of ranch work that followed the seasons. "See how that heifer's holding her head?" Jake would ask, pointing across a pasture. "She's favoring her left front leg, probably stepped in a gopher hole. We'll need to bring her in and check for swelling." Martha absorbed everything with the same methodical attention she'd once given to perfecting her bread recipes. She learned that ranching was equal parts science and intuition, requiring knowledge of animal behavior, grass management, weather patterns, and market prices. Each decision rippled through the months ahead: when to breed cows, where to rotate pastures, how many steers to sell before winter. Her cooking transformed along with her understanding. The delicate stews gave way to hearty beans slow, cooked with salt pork, thick steaks that could fuel a man through a day of fence mending, and bread dense enough to carry in saddlebags. She learned to stretch supplies during blizzards and to preserve meat during slaughter season. Her hands grew rough and capable, equally at home kneading dough or helping deliver a breech calf. The ranch hands watched this transformation with growing amazement. Martha had become one of them in ways they hadn't expected, not just the woman who cooked their meals, but someone who understood the rhythm of their work. When a late spring storm threatened newborn calves, she rode out with the men to move the herd to shelter. When a prairie fire swept down from the north, she fought it with wet sacks and grim determination. But it was during the great drought of her second summer that Martha truly found her place on the Double Bar Ranch. The rains failed week after week, and the grass withered to brown stubble. Water holes dried up, and the cattle grew thin and desperate. Samuel spent sleepless nights calculating how many head they could afford to keep through winter, while neighboring ranches began selling off entire herds at devastating losses. Martha watched her husband grow gaunt with worry, saw the way Jake's shoulders sagged as he surveyed the barren pastures. The other ranchers' wives whispered about moving back to town, abandoning the land that had betrayed them. But Martha saw something different when she looked across those empty miles. She saw possibility. "What if we drilled for water?" she asked Samuel one scorching evening as they sat on the porch, too hot to sleep. "We've got the windmill by the house," he replied warily. "It's not enough for the whole herd. No, I mean really drill. Deep wells across the property. Jake says the water table runs underneath everything, we just need to reach it." Samuel looked at her with tired eyes. "You know how much that would cost. We'd have to mortgage everything, and if we don't hit water, if we don't try, we lose everything anyway," Martha said quietly. "But if it works, we'd never be at the mercy of the weather again. Other ranches would pay to graze their cattle on our land during dry years." The decision to drill changed everything about their marriage and their future. Samuel had to trust Martha's judgment completely, mortgaging the ranch and betting their entire life on her vision of underground rivers. For 3 months, they lived with the sound of drilling equipment and the constant anxiety of debt. Martha cooked for the drill crews in addition to the ranch hands, stretching every dollar while they waited to learn if they'd found salvation or bankruptcy. When the first well hit water at 200 feet, Martha was standing beside Samuel, their hands clasped tight as water bubbled up from the earth like a miracle. Jake let out a whoop that echoed across the prairie, and even the weathered drill crew foreman smiled. By winter, they had 4 producing wells scattered across the ranch, each one surrounded by green grass that drew cattle like a magnet. The drought broke the following spring, but the wells remained, transforming the Double Bar from a struggling ranch into one of the most prosperous spreads in Montana territory. Other ranchers came to study their system, and Martha found herself explaining not just the technical aspects of well drilling, but the broader vision of sustainable ranching that had driven their investment. "Water is everything out here," she would tell visitors, standing beside a windmill with the endless sky above her. "Control the water, and you control your destiny." But success brought unexpected challenges. Martha discovered that prosperity could be as testing as hardship, requiring different kinds of strength and wisdom. They received offers to sell the ranch for astronomical sums, and Samuel struggled with the temptation to cash out and live easily in town. The ranch hands worried that new wealth would change their tight, knit community, bringing in strangers and corporate investors who didn't understand the bonds forged through shared hardship. Martha realized that her role had evolved far beyond cooking or even ranching. She had become the keeper of something precious, a way of life that balanced progress with tradition, innovation with respect for the land. When cattle buyers visited, they found themselves negotiating not just with Samuel, but with a woman who understood every aspect of their operation, from grass management to market trends. The transformation became complete during Martha's third winter on the ranch, when a blizzard trapped them for 2 weeks with no contact with the outside world. Instead of the helpless city woman who had arrived 3 years earlier, the ranch hands found themselves relying on Martha's leadership and judgment. She organized work shifts, rationed supplies, and coordinated the rescue of cattle trapped in snow drifts. When the storm finally broke, Samuel realized that somewhere along the way, Martha had become not just his wife but his true partner in every sense. "You know," Jake told her as they surveyed the storm damage, "I was pretty skeptical when Sam married a city woman. Figured you'd be gone by the first hard winter." Martha smiled, watching Samuel direct the cleanup efforts with the confidence of a man who knew his land and his people. "I was pretty skeptical myself. I thought I was just looking for security, a place to cook and keep house." "What changed your mind?" "I realized that security isn't something you find," Martha replied. "It's something you build, with your own hands and heart. This place taught me that I was capable of more than I ever imagined." The ranch hands, who had initially wondered if the city woman would survive, now sought her advice on everything from animal husbandry to business decisions. Martha had become the bridge between the practical wisdom of men like Jake and the changing world beyond the ranch boundaries. She corresponded with agricultural colleges, subscribed to ranching journals, and attended cattlemen's association meetings, where she was often the only woman present. But perhaps the most profound change was in Martha's relationship with Samuel. What had begun as a practical arrangement between two lonely people had grown into something neither had expected. They had discovered love not through courtship and romance, but through shared challenges, mutual respect, and the deep satisfaction of building something meaningful together. On quiet evenings, they would sit on the porch watching the sun set over land they had learned to understand and cherish. Martha's hands, now calloused and strong, would rest in Samuel's as they planned for seasons ahead. The woman who had once known only how to cook had become someone who could read the sky for weather signs, deliver breech calves, negotiate cattle prices, and envision a future that stretched far beyond the horizon. "Do you ever miss the boarding house?" Samuel asked one such evening, watching their cattle graze peacefully around the windmills that had changed their lives. Martha considered the question seriously, remembering the small room and predictable days of her former life. "I miss the simplicity sometimes," she admitted, "but I wouldn't trade what we've built here for all the simplicity in the world. I thought I wanted security, but what I really needed was purpose." The Double Bar Ranch had become more than a successful cattle operation. It was proof that people could change, could grow beyond the limitations they placed on themselves. Martha's story spread throughout the territory, the city woman who had learned to ranch and in doing so had discovered strength she never knew she possessed. Young women from town sometimes visited, drawn by tales of Martha's transformation. She would show them around the ranch, explaining not just the practical aspects of ranching, but the deeper truth she had learned, that security came not from hiding within familiar boundaries, but from having the courage to expand them. "I came here knowing only how to cook," she would tell them, "but the land taught me that I could learn anything I was willing to work for. The question isn't what you know now, it's what you're willing to become." Years passed, and Martha's reputation grew throughout Montana territory. Ranchers sought her advice not just on water management, but on every aspect of sustainable ranching. She developed new techniques for grass rotation that preserved the prairie while maximizing cattle yields. Her innovations in food preservation allowed the ranch to operate more independently during harsh winters, and her business acumen helped them navigate the volatile cattle markets that could make or break a rancher overnight. But Martha never forgot the woman she had been when she first arrived at the Double Bar. Sometimes, late in the evening after a particularly challenging day, she would return to the kitchen that had been her first domain. She would knead bread with the same careful attention she had always given to the task, finding peace in the familiar rhythm of her hands working the dough. The difference now was that she understood how this simple act connected to everything else: the wheat grown on carefully managed fields, the cattle that would be fed and strengthened for the work ahead, the men whose respect she had earned through competence and determination. Samuel often found her during these quiet moments, and they would talk about the plans they were making for the ranch's future. They spoke of expanding their breeding program, of the new barn they wanted to build, of the young couple from Nebraska who had written asking for guidance in starting their own ranch. Their conversations were those of true partners, each bringing different strengths to their shared vision. One autumn evening, as they sat watching their cattle graze in pastures green from the wells they had risked everything to drill, Martha reflected on the woman who had stepped off the train 5 years earlier. That woman had been seeking security in its simplest form: a roof, regular meals, protection from an uncertain world. But the land had taught her that real security came from within, from the confidence that she could meet whatever challenges arose. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her thoughts. A wagon was coming up the long drive, carrying what looked like a family: a man, woman, and several children, their possessions packed carefully around them. Samuel stood to greet them, and Martha smoothed her skirts before joining him. She had learned to read the signs: the way the man sat in the wagon seat, the careful arrangement of their belongings, the quiet hope in their faces mixed with the uncertainty of people facing an unknown future. Evening. The man called as he pulled the wagon to a stop. "Name's Thomas Peterson. This is my wife Ellen and our children. We heard in town that you might have work for a man willing to learn ranching." Martha studied Ellen Peterson's face and saw something achingly familiar, the same combination of determination and fear that she had felt when she first arrived at the double bar. Ellen's hands, like Martha's had been, were soft and pale, the hands of a woman who had spent her life in town. But there was something in her eyes that suggested she might be ready to discover capabilities she didn't yet know she possessed. "We do have work," Samuel said carefully, "but ranch life isn't easy, especially with children. Are you sure this is what you want?" Thomas Peterson straightened in the wagon seat. "We lost our store when the railroad changed routes. Got nothing left in town but debts. I figure a man can learn anything if he's willing to work hard enough." Martha stepped forward, her eyes meeting Ellen Peterson's. "And what about you, Mrs. Peterson? Are you prepared for what ranch life might demand?" Ellen Peterson lifted her chin with a gesture Martha remembered making herself years earlier. "I can cook and sew and tend children. I figure that's a start. Beyond that, I suppose I'll learn what needs learning." Martha smiled, recognizing the echo of her own words from years before. "Then I think you'll do just fine. Samuel, I believe we can find a place for the Peterson family. Mr. Peterson can start by working with Jake, and Mrs. Peterson can help me with the household and learn what she's interested in learning." As they helped the Peterson family unload their wagon and settle into the small house that had been built for married hands, Martha felt the satisfying completion of a circle. She had come to the double bar as a woman who only knew how to cook, seeking security in its simplest form. Now she was in a position to offer another woman the same opportunity. She had been given the chance to discover strengths she never knew she possessed. Later that evening, after the Peterson children had been fed and put to bed, Martha found Ellen standing on the porch of the small house, looking out at the vast expanse of grassland that stretched to the horizon. The same overwhelming sense of space that had intimidated Martha on her first night was now playing across Ellen's features. "It's so big," Ellen said quietly. "So empty. How do you stand it?" Martha remembered asking herself the same question. "It's not empty," she said gently. "It's full of possibilities. You just have to learn how to see them." Over the following months, Martha watched Ellen Peterson's transformation with the same fascination she imagined others had felt watching her own evolution. Ellen proved to be a quick learner, eager to understand not just the household duties, but the larger workings of the ranch. She learned to read weather signs, to recognize the signs of illness in cattle, to understand the delicate balance of grass management that kept the land healthy and productive. Thomas Peterson, meanwhile, worked alongside Jake Morrison and the other hands, learning the skills that would make him valuable as a ranch hand. His background in business proved useful as he quickly grasped the economic aspects of ranching, the careful calculations that determined when to buy and sell, when to expand and when to consolidate. But it was Ellen's growing confidence that reminded Martha most powerfully of her own journey. watching the other woman learn to ride, to assist with difficult births among the cattle, to make quick decisions during emergencies. Martha saw reflected the same process of discovery she had undergone. Ellen was learning, as Martha had learned, that security came not from limiting oneself to familiar tasks, but from developing the confidence to tackle unfamiliar challenges. The seasons turned, and the Peterson family became an integral part of the Double Bar Ranch. Ellen proved to have a natural gift for animal husbandry, developing an intuitive understanding of cattle behavior that impressed even Jake Morrison. Thomas showed promise as a future foreman, combining his business sense with growing practical skills. One spring morning, as Martha and Ellen worked together to treat a cow with milk fever, Ellen looked up from the animal and said, "I never imagined I could do something like this. Back in town, I thought I was only good for keeping house and minding children." Martha smiled, remembering her own amazement at discovering capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. The land has a way of teaching us what we're capable of if we're willing to listen. "Were you frightened when you first came here?" Ellen asked. "Terrified," Martha admitted. "I thought I was coming to cook and keep house, nothing more. I had no idea I was signing up for a complete education in who I could become." As the years passed, Martha's role on the Double Bar continued to evolve. She became not just Samuel's partner in running the ranch, but a mentor to other women who came seeking opportunity on the frontier. Some came as wives, others as daughters of families seeking new starts. All of them found in Martha an example of what was possible when a woman was willing to expand beyond the boundaries others had set for her. The Double Bar Ranch became known throughout Montana Territory, not just for its innovative water management and successful cattle operation, but for the way it developed human potential. Young men came to learn ranching from Samuel and Jake, but they also learned business principles from Martha. Young women discovered that they could master skills traditionally reserved for men while still maintaining the domestic arts that had been their original training. Martha established what she called the Pioneer Women's School, though it was less formal than the name suggested. It was simply her way of sharing what she had learned with other women who found themselves on the frontier, whether by choice or circumstance. She taught them to read cattle behavior, to understand market fluctuations, to manage household finances, and most importantly, to believe in their own capacity for growth and change. Word of Martha's school spread, and women began traveling from other territories to spend time at the Double Bar. They came as students but left as teachers, taking back to their own communities the knowledge and confidence they had gained. Some established their own schools, creating a network of frontier women committed to supporting each other's growth and development. The transformation of the Double Bar Ranch and of Martha herself became a symbol throughout the territory of what was possible when people refused to accept limitations imposed by others or themselves. Newspapers wrote about the Miracle Ranch, where a city woman had learned to read the land like a book and had turned a struggling cattle operation into one of the most successful in the territory. But for Martha, the true miracle was not in the success of the ranch or the recognition she received. It was in the daily discovery that she could continue to grow, to learn, to become more than she had ever imagined possible. Every sunrise brought new challenges and new opportunities to test herself against the vast Montana sky. Samuel often marveled at the woman his practical mail-order bride had become. She had exceeded every expectation, not just as a ranch partner, but as someone who had created something entirely new, a way of life that honored both tradition and innovation, that valued both individual growth and community support. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they stood together watching the sun set over land they had transformed and that had transformed them in return, Samuel spoke the words that had been in his heart for years. "I thought I was getting a cook," he said quietly. "Instead, I got a partner, a teacher, and the strongest woman I've ever known." Martha leaned against his shoulder, watching their cattle move slowly toward the wells that had secured their future. "I thought I was getting security," she replied. "Instead, I got adventure, purpose, and a chance to become someone I never dreamed I could be." The Double Bar Ranch stretched endlessly before them, its success built on water drawn from deep underground sources and on human potential that had proved to be just as deep and just as life-giving. Martha had learned that the question was never what a person knew when they started. It was what they were willing to become when the land and life demanded more. She had married a rancher knowing only how to cook, but the frontier had taught her that cooking was just the beginning. Everything else, the riding, the ranching, the business decisions, the leadership, the teaching had been waiting inside her all along, needing only courage and opportunity to emerge. In discovering what she was truly capable of, Martha had helped others discover the same truth about themselves. As the stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, Martha knew that her story was far from over. There would be new challenges, new people to help, new ways to grow and contribute. She had learned that true security came not from staying within familiar boundaries, but from having the confidence to expand them whenever life demanded more. The woman who had stepped off the train knowing only how to cook had become someone who could do anything she set her mind to, and more importantly, someone who could help others discover the same limitless potential within themselves.